Canadians got their first look this morning at the federal government's financial picture since the October election, and it's a mixed bag of good news and bad news. According to Finance Minister Bill Morneau, the economy is sound and growing at a solid pace, second only to the U.S. in the G7. And despite some weak periods, 2019 has recorded the highest number of jobs added this decade, nearly 400,000. But then there's that dreaded D word, the deficit. The size of it now projected to be $26.6 billion this year, nearly $7 billion higher than the estimated spring budget. That's in part because of a new tax cut and higher pension obligations. There is still no plan for this government to balance the books as well. So now that the government has more wiggle room, or less wiggle room rather, how will they afford all of their campaign promises? Bill Morneau is the Minister of Finance, and he joins me now. So, Minister Morneau, I want to talk about promises that you've made. When we look at the numbers that you put out today, debt to GDP ratio, keeping that going down, and some big election promises you made. You don't have a lot of headroom. So what comes first? What's more important to you? Keeping that debt to GDP ratio going down, or making promises, delivering on promises that you've made, like pharmacare, dental care, things that the provinces are asking you for?
Well, they're both important, and we're going to have to find a way to do both. But what's clearly the case from my perspective is we need to ensure that we have a strong financial position. We always need to be prepared for whatever comes our way. The good news is we're starting from a good position. I mean, our economy is strong and growing. We've got very low unemployment. I mean, this year we'll see the likely outcome of this year will be the lowest rate of unemployment in 40 years. Wages are growing, so the average Canadian's got wage growth in excess of inflation. So those are very positive starting points. And that means we've got the capacity to make the kind of investments we said we would make last week. So the tax reduction is the single biggest promise we made in the election campaign in terms of financial promise. And we're moving forward on that. And that was baked into the forecast I put out today. So we're going to have to keep working to make sure that our fiscal house is in order. We'll need to work with the other parties in Parliament to move forward on the promises that we made in the campaign. And I'm confident we can do both.
Do you acknowledge, though, that you don't have a lot of headroom, that you're in a bit of a tough spot here when it comes to delivering on all of these things?
Well, nobody ever told me that it was going to be easy to figure out how to do this, and that's a continuing theme. I mean, obviously, if we continue to invest in the economy, if we have growth that is strong, that provides us with a greater margin to maneuver. And at the same time...
But growth is somewhat sluggish.
Well, we have real headwinds. I mean, we have global trade that's been reducing over the course of the last couple of years. We've had, obviously, some real challenges out west. But at the same time, we have very strong pockets of the economy. I mean, our services sector is very strong. Business profits overall are higher than the norm. So we are in a situation where there are certainly competing winds, tailwinds and headwinds. And we're going to continue investing. We're going to continue to make sure that we see the kind of results that we've seen over the last few years. And my job is to prepare us for any potential challenges. And that's what the Prime Minister asked me to do in my mandate letter, and I'm going to follow through on that.
So, but as you are making that preparation, debt to GDP ratio on the one hand, say universal pharmacare on the other, which one is the bigger priority? Which one goes first when you decide what to do?
They have to go together. So I'm not going to be able to say which one goes first. Clearly, the first steps in the getting to having everyone have access to pharmaceuticals is negotiating with the provinces and coming up with an approach that allows us to actually do that. So it's not overnight magic that we can turn the situation from where it is to where we want to get to. It is starting by reducing the costs, which we're doing, moving forward, negotiating with the provinces to get to a better outcome. That will take time. We hope to make it the shortest possible time. And as we do that, my job will be to keep working on ensuring that our fiscal house is in order.
You mentioned the provinces. There has been a lot of attention paid recently, perhaps during the election, but particularly in the aftermath, I would say, on a national level, to the challenges that people are facing in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, to someone who works in the natural resources sector in that province who is listening to you today and says, when is help coming my way? I see you talking about spending a lot of money on pharmacare, on dental care. What would you say to that individual about when they can expect help from the federal government?
I think what I would say, first of all, to that individual is I really do understand the challenges. I mean, it is a very real issue for people worrying about their job, worrying that the sector that they've been employed in and doing well in is having such enormous challenges. What does help mean? I mean, obviously, from our standpoint, it means making sure we get a fair price for our resources. So that Trans Mountain pipeline expansion is moving forward. There are about 2,200 people on that project right now. The LNG investment is moving forward. That's very significant as well. So those things will have important impacts on the immediate term. In the longer term, you know, I met last week with the Finance Minister of Alberta, and we talked about ways that we can improve the situation longer term, including, you know, investing in technology that would reduce the impact from a carbon standpoint of the sector that we have, thinking about other ways that we can advance in Alberta and Saskatchewan to improve people's outcomes. So it has to be short term in terms of actually getting to a fair price, and longer term thinking about how we can advance not only the sector but those economies to face up to the future.
If I'm that individual, though, I'm not sure what I heard in your answer that gives me hope. I mean, you talk about TMX being short-term relief, but it's being built right now. It's not increasing pipeline capacity in a way that's going to help people who work in the sector.
Well, if you're looking at the very short term, of course, you know, I'm recognizing that we do have programs that deal with people who are immediately out of work, and that's a very real challenge. But I think that what we need to do is give people hope that we will be able to get to a fair price. We are working on that in the longer term, that we will be making the kinds of investments that ensure that the sector can be more and more successful. I would not want to be promising anybody something that we can't deliver. I think we need to understand that this is real. The challenge is difficult. The kinds of things that Premier Kenney and, you know, Finance Minister Toews have put on the table, we're listening to. I mean, they start with Trans Mountain Pipeline. They talk about, you know, looking at the programs we have like stabilization. They talk about other things that we can do working together like oil well remediation. We're going to talk through all of these issues to see where we can be a partner.
I want to touch on fiscal stabilization mechanism because that's one way that Alberta is hoping to see a little bit more money. I understand that the discussions still have to happen, but how long would it take to get that money out the door if indeed that is a route that you choose to pursue?
Well, the process for thinking about that program is, first of all, we need to listen to all the provinces. So far, really, we've been listening to Alberta and Saskatchewan. Alberta directly to me. I haven't been speaking to the other premiers or the other finance ministers about it. Much of it's been in the media. So tonight and tomorrow will be an important day for us to listen and understand different perspectives. The program hasn't been reviewed since 1995, so there is every reason to think that we should look at it. But I need to make sure that this is in the context of people's points of view. So then it'll be some analysis. It'll be some consideration of what people have to say, some analysis, and that needn't take terribly long, but I can't predict right now because I don't know what I'm going to hear tonight and tomorrow.
You have talked a lot about the fact that you're listening. The Deputy Prime Minister has talked about the fact that she is listening, and I just want to come back to this question of when listening turns into action for people who are really feeling the pinch of this right now.
Well, I think maybe I'll have a better way of answering you after I do the listening. So, I mean, giving you a false timeline doesn't help anybody. Certainly, we need to start by listening, and you know, the timeline that I'm working towards is you know, getting together with my colleagues in January period to try and understand what it is we're hearing. And only after that could we consider what next steps are. But there may be, I want to remind you and through you, your viewers, that there may be other priorities that are on the table that are also important. So it's not just one program that we need to think about. I mean, when Minister Toews came to talk to me, he talked about a number of things, all of which seemed reasonable for us to be considering together. And so we'll need to evaluate which of those have the greatest potential for helping out, and which of those are, you know, not ones that cause us challenges in other parts of the country.
Do you think any of those decisions could be made in time for a First Minister's meeting in the new year? Would that be an appropriate time to?
Well, I'm just not going to predict, but I appreciate that you want me to.
Thank you very much for your time today, Bill Morneau.
Thanks a lot.
Well, we just heard from Finance Minister Bill Morneau about his government's fiscal update made public earlier today. He announced no new spending plans. He says the economy is strong and growing, but the deficit is projected to balloon by billions of dollars more than expected. So, how are opposition parties viewing the numbers? Pat Kelly is the Conservative Deputy Finance Critic. He joins us from Calgary. And in Vancouver, Peter Julian is the NDP's Finance Critic. Welcome to you both. Pat Kelly, I'm going to start with you. The Finance Minister says he believes he can keep lowering the debt to GDP ratio and keep election promises like making investments in pharmacare, dental care. Do you think that that's realistic?
No, and I think that his own update reveals that that's not happening. We're seeing a modest increase in that, and most importantly, the overall ballooning deficit that we're seeing under this finance minister and the repeated broken promises on the deficit. There's just really no reason to, I think, assign much credibility to his assurances. This is a finance minister that promised in 2015 a maximum $10 billion deficit, a balanced budget by 2019, and here we are now with a fall fiscal update that reveals that his own deficit projections of just a few months ago, just before the election, have now been blown.
Well, Pat Kelly, I guess I would say to you that his government has just been re-elected, admittedly a minority government, but by Canadians who knew that he wasn't going to attempt to balance the books this time out.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's true that they did form a minority parliament. If more Canadians voted for our plan than his, it would. But we live in a divided country where there was no consensus on who should lead Canada as a result of this election, and he is on notice, and his government is on notice. Canadians, far more Canadians voted for other parties than voted for this finance minister's party, and the financial management that he's exhibited thus far.
Well, you mentioned other parties. I think it's time to bring in Peter Julian. And I want to ask you the same question, Peter Julian, about the fact that the finance minister is saying we can keep decreasing the debt to GDP ratio. So basically keep this financial anchor in place, but that they're also going to find a way, he believes that they can find a way to introduce new spending around things that are a priority for your party, things like pharmacare, dental care. Do you think that he can do both?
Well, to start off, it's very disappointing, the fall economic update, because he doesn't actually spell out the kind of investments that are going to make a difference in people's lives. Canadians that are struggling with a lack of affordable housing, struggling to pay for their medication, not having access to dental care. We've got First Nations communities that have no drinkable water, and the climate emergency. All of these things require investments. Now, the reality is, what we see is a mirror image between the deficit that Canada has and the fact that the Parliamentary Budgetary Officer has attributed over $25 billion in tax dollars going to overseas tax havens. So we need to start plugging the loopholes, putting in place a wealth tax for the super wealthy in Canada, building a fair tax system, because that allows us then the fiscal ability to make the investments that are going to make a lot difference in Canadians' lives. And Canadian families are struggling with a record level of family debt.
So, Peter Julian, I want to bring the question. I want to bring the question back to you, though. I appreciate that these are the priorities of your party. Do you think that, and the Liberals have expressed some interest in some of them, notably pharmacare, dental care. Do you think that the Liberals can continue to decrease the debt to GDP ratio? Should they stick to this financial anchor that they're now holding on to, or should they just pursue those spending priorities without any consideration of that?
Well, what I'm saying is there's a third option, and the third option is actually plugging the tax loopholes, actually shutting down the overseas tax havens. The type of handouts that we've seen going to corporate CEOs, $14 billion last year for the fall economic update, those kinds of handouts and the massive tax loopholes that we're seeing need to be closed, so that those, at the same time, we can make the investments that'll actually make a difference in families' lives. And we saw record deficits under the Harper Conservatives too. The reality is we need to build a fair tax system, and at the same time we need to make investments that are going to make a difference in Canadians' lives. Canadian families are struggling, and it's about time the federal government put them first over the very wealthy in this country.
I would note, Mr. Julian, that the federal government is pitching getting tough on tax cheats, but that is something that is notorious. And I'm talking specifically about people who are moving their money elsewhere, but that is notoriously different to do. But Pat Kelly, I want to bring you back into the conversation. There was something that your party's finance critic, Pierre Poilievre, talked about repeatedly this morning that I thought was an interesting point. Talked about a made-in-Canada recession. Now, that is despite the fact that there are 14 independent economists that the government consulted here. They are all predicting growth. So I wonder why your party is raising the specter of a recession when you have quite a large pool of independent economists who say that's simply not the case.
Well, I think my colleague, Mr. Poilievre, pointed out quite rightly that the November jobs report was horrendous. It showed
but that's in the context of a broader national jobs report.
Well, it's the most recent information.
Yes, but the year overall, we're talking about something like 400,000 new jobs created. I don't mean to minimize anyone who was dealing with job losses in the past month, but in the broader context, the numbers are not nearly as dire.
The indications are that insolvencies are up, that people have the most recent reports indicate significant job losses in our economy at the same time that our peers, the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, Germany, they are adding jobs and we are losing jobs. So if a recession is indeed on the horizon, and there are many indicators that it may well be, this will be a made-in-Canada recession.
Would the best indicator of all, though, not be a perspective from a broad pool of independent economists? So I guess my question is, why do you keep insisting that this is a possibility despite considerable expert commentary to the contrary?
Well, I think we are not predicting a recession. We are not suggesting that there is proof, or that that everybody else that is saying there may not be is wrong. But should one occur, and there are indications, the troubling numbers in job statistics, the troubling numbers of insolvencies, the volume of foreign direct investment that is fleeing Canada, all indicate strong headwinds ahead of us, and should we tip into recession, it will be on this government's shoulders, because it will be a made-in-Canada recession, one that the same indicators don't appear in our G7 peers.
Peter Julian, I want to bring you back into the conversation. We've only got a bit of time left. I want to go back to this question, though, of your party's priorities, pharmacare, dental care. When the government introduced its tax cut just recently, you made a pitch for using a bit of that money towards dental care. You getting any response back? What sort of communications are you having with the Liberals about the possibility of some movement on your priorities?
Well, you remember last Monday, Bill Morneau said that they would introduce and pass a Ways and Means motion on Wednesday. That was last Wednesday. So the government backing off, pushing through the Ways and Means motion with their original proposal, I think shows that there is some movement. What Jagmeet Singh and what the NDP are proposing just make good sense, that we cap the tax changes at $90,000. Really hitting most Canadians in a positive way, providing supports for them, and at the same time can provide basic dental care for 4.5 million Canadians that have no dental care right now. That helps to relieve the stress on the healthcare system and makes a big difference for 4.5 million Canadians that don't have access to dental care.
Are you getting any positive signs in your communications with the government, though, that you are even one step closer to any of this being a reality?
Well, I think the government changed its intent to pass the Ways and Means last week. That shows me that they're certainly taking a step back, and that's welcome, because quite frankly, we took their suggestion and made it much, much better. It's going to have a better impact on Canadian families. So we're hopeful that they'll be open to this, and this will be what they'll bring back in January.
Okay, Pat Kelly, I'd like to bring you in just one last time here, because there is a provincial and federal territorial finance ministers meeting starting tonight, continuing into tomorrow. Obviously, they're going to be talking about the Fiscal Stabilization Fund and whether or not there might be some more money for provinces going through difficult times. Do you agree with that kind of spending, as much as you're calling for restraint from the Liberals? Do you think the government should go ahead and agree to that?
Well, we just came through an election campaign where I heard on my own on the doorsteps in my own riding, the frustration and anger, quite frankly, felt by so many of my own constituents over the prolonged economic downturn in our province, and they are frustrated that that their federal government has done so much to prevent us in Alberta from being able to get our products to market and to be able to and chased away investment in our own economy. And they are looking for relief.
And is this the answer? Is this part of the answer?
Well, it may be. I'll leave it for the First Ministers to discuss this evening. But we're looking for something. There are some very upset people in Alberta, and this is not just something that is talked about by people on panels in the media. This is doorstep conversation that I heard throughout the campaign. This is very real to many people here in Alberta.
Okay, we're going to have to leave this discussion there. I thank you both very much for your time, Pat Kelly and Peter Julian. What kind of financial shape is the country in? Well, let's ask the experts. Rebecca Young is Director of Economic and Fiscal Policy at Scotiabank Economics. She also worked for the Federal Finance Department from 2006 to 2015. She joins us from Toronto. And Kevin Page is the founding president and CEO of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa and the first parliamentary budget officer for Canada. He's here in studio. Thank you both for joining us today. Kevin Page, I guess I'll start by asking you, we just heard a little bit more from the Finance Minister, pretty consistent, frankly, with what he's been saying throughout the day, but we've got that information. I see you have got a copy of the fiscal update with you. What's been the most striking thing that you've heard today?
Well, I think most people have been focused on the fact that the deficit has gotten bigger, and some people are a little bit surprised. Maybe it's just a year-over-year increase in the deficit, going from 14 to almost $27 billion. I think as well. I mean, there's really, the issue, does the government really have a fiscal plan? Do they have a budgetary constraint? And the finance minister says, yes, we do. It's a declining debt to GDP ratio. And yet when all of us look at this document, and we look at the debt to GDP ratio, it actually doesn't decline for many years. So, and again, we're waiting on to see a host more and more measures, which we'll see in the budget, so it'll put upward pressure on the deficit.
Okay, Rebecca Young, I'd like to bring you in. When you hear the finance minister saying, we're listening, we are interested in what the needs are of the provinces and the various, we want to stick to our election promises, but at the same time, we do plan to stick to that fiscal anchor. How realistic do you think that is?
Well, first of all, I think that you categorized it appropriately, that today's update was really a good news, bad news story. And so the good news was that fiscal trends were largely playing out as expected. And so we did see strong revenue performance, in fact, that were masked by otherwise upside pressures on these pension costs. And so the bad news was that deficits are increasing. The good news, though, is that we do see, for the first time, more optimism around the growth outlook. We've looked at a year now where we've had constant revisions downward of where the growth outlook was going for the Canadian economy. And so I think the fact that we're seeing more or less a flat outlook versus the springtime budget is positive. The fact that we do have strong revenues, largely from employment revenues through taxes, through lower higher EI premiums, et cetera. So I think those are positives. But on the other side, we do have these higher deficits because of pensions. And so it really does beg the question. On Friday, the finance minister was given a mandate to reduce debt as a function of the economy. And then Monday, we do see an update that says that we will see an increase this year in that debt to GDP ratio. It'll stay there next year before coming down modestly in years to come. And yet we still have platform commitments outstanding. And so, how binding will that constraint be will be the burning question in everyone's minds.
So what I hear you saying is, ooh, that's going to be tough. I guess, Kevin Page, if you were to give Bill Morneau a piece of advice as he heads into these meetings with his provincial and territorial counterparts, I mean, he made the point that what they're all really thinking about is, can the federal government give me the money I need? What advice would you give to him as the counterparts are asking for some more cash?
I think, well, it would, for the finance minister to go to the provinces and say, we've heard your demands at the last Council of the Federation meeting. They talked about increasing the Canada Health Transfer by 5.2%, which is, about 1.5% more than what, it is growing, which GDP is expected to grow at, which is the ceiling. So, our finance minister doesn't really have, relative to his own fiscal targets, much room to maneuver. And so I think the provinces probably know that. So it's going to be a really difficult conversation as well when we're sitting on a deficit that's upwards of $27 billion in 1920. to provide somehow a kind of an ex post adjustment to the fiscal stabilization program to help Alberta and maybe Saskatchewan as well, which could be recipients, it'll be a little bit hard for him to find the kind of that flexibility. So I think it's tough. Like there's not a lot of room to maneuver. He's in a squeeze.
Rebecca Young, I just want to ask you now, much has been said on even this program today about the prospect of a recession and whether or not one is realistic. We pointed out earlier that the 14 independent economists cited by Finance Canada say that's, growth may be sluggish, but we're not headed towards a recession. If there are challenging economic times ahead, though, whether or not it qualifies as a recession, how well situated, how well positioned is the government to deal with that financially?
Well, I think, first of all, to step back, the deficits will be in the order of 1.2% GDP over the next 2 years. And so that's not alarmingly high when you step back. I think it does eat into some of the fiscal power. But quite frankly, if we are in a serious downturn, we're looking at upward of 4%, 5%, even 6% of GDP that's going to be required. And so the federal balance sheet does have the capacity, and there will be an imperative in a serious downturn for it to respond in full force. So I think it is legitimate that it is in the finance minister's mandate to prepare. I don't think it's just about quantums and about saving spending now. It's also about what policy levers are you going to use, because it's a difference between a 3% spend and a 6% spend, whether you target it, whether it's timely, whether it hits the economy when and where it's needed. So I think that conversation is important to be had now, to be prepared if and when a recession does occur.
Is there any way to glean, though, whether the government is making the necessary preparations?
I think the fact that it appears in the mandate letter for the finance minister puts it squarely in his ballpark. And so I think that those conversations will be had. It's not the sort of thing that you see in the headlines. Quite frankly, there can be recession fear-mongering. And so if the Department of Finance is talking always about a recession, that could set off alarm bells. But I think it is appropriate that they have conversations even about things like the automatic stabilizers, that what in the good times will smooth out some of the downturns in the economy without actually requiring direct government intervention. And so those are important conversations and quite frankly take time to play out. And so it's best in a calmer economic period like today to have those conversations, to be prepared for when the next downturn occurs.
Okay. Thank you very much both for your insights. Thank you, Rebecca Young and Kevin Page.
I really do understand the challenges. I mean, it is a very real issue for people worrying about their job, worrying that the sector that they've been employed in and doing well in is having such enormous challenges. What does help mean? I mean, obviously, from our standpoint, it means making sure we get a fair price for our resources. So that Trans Mountain pipeline expansion is moving forward. There are about 2,200 people on that project right now. The LNG investment is moving forward. That's very significant as well.
Federal Finance Minister Bill Morneau has a big job ahead of him. He needs to control spending while addressing increased pressure from the provinces to hand over more cash. It is a delicate balancing act that begins this evening when he meets with his provincial and territorial counterparts. So, how difficult is the task at hand? Let's ask the Power Panel. Former Conservative Cabinet Minister Stockwell Day is in Calgary. Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan Finance Minister, now Chief of Government Relations for the University of Toronto. He is in Toronto. Former Quebec Liberal Cabinet Minister Yolande James joins us from Montreal, and the CBC's very own John Paul Tasker is here with me in studio. Hello, everyone. Hello. So Andrew Thompson, I want to start with you, speaking as a former finance minister. When Bill Morneau says that he believes that he can make it all happen, keep debt to GDP ratio going down, but also find a way to spend money on all these big new election promises, how realistic do you think that is?
I'm not sure it's terribly realistic. I mean, one of the challenges right now is the debt to GDP ratio, although it's stable, relatively stable, is still really high in the country. What the Liberals are reporting federally doesn't take into account provincial debt or debt held in municipalities. And when we look at that, what we see is the debt to GDP ratio grow substantially. So it's sitting somewhere, around 95% of GDP, which is pretty high. But what we really are going to have to watch, and we're seeing this today in the fiscal update, and we'll see it play out over the next couple of days with the finance ministers, is a tale of two different sets of budgets in two different countries almost. a fairly well-off, well-positioned federal government that seems quite happy to keep spending money, and a set of relatively impoverished provinces, many of whom are suffering from some real financial shocks that are in the process of cutting programs. Getting that fiscal balance right is really what's going to be playing out, I think, politically over the next couple of days.
Yolanda, I'd like to bring you in here. How much pressure do you think Bill Morneau is under to just add even more to the deficit, given the pressures that Andrew was just talking about?
Well, I mean, there is pressure on both sides, but that's nothing new, right? I think today in Bill Morneau's presentation, he wanted to stay the course to be quite frank, to a strategy that has been successful for the government. They're not projecting a recession. That being said, they will have to deliver on the new indicator because there is still amongst the population concern with a growing deficit. The government, and this was prior to the election, has stayed the course with trying to make sure that we look at the debt to GDP ratio and see that lower over a period of time. So it comes down to going to have to be making choices. I think the fact that the ministers of finance are meeting tonight and tomorrow is an important story as well, because there was in the last communique, remember after the Council of Federation, two things that kind of stood out. It was like a page and a half, a press release, where they wanted increase to health transfers. Well, today the minister said that was staying at 3%. They were asking for, I think, 5.2. And the other was the stabilization program. I understand that there's more opening there on the government's front. So I think that they I would imagine are more open to discussing on that. But with the health transfers, well, that looks like that's something that's going to be more of a negative. So it's a delicate balance, and I think it's a good strategy, but it's not a strategy without risks, that's for sure.
Stockwell Day, I want to bring you in here. When you're reading the tea leaves, trying to discern what Bill Morneau is indicating about this openness to what Alberta is asking for, how likely do you think it is that the government is going to go down that path?
Well, it's not black tea leaves. We're not on the black by any means. And as a matter of fact, it gets worse. And at least the finance minister was admitting that the deficit continues to be out of control in terms of their previous forecast. That means the debt gets larger. And every dollar that goes to paying down the banks to pay on the growing debt is a dollar you can't spend somewhere else, like helping provinces with healthcare, for instance. There's an interesting close in their press release and in his commentary. It's kind of like, hey, we have nothing to worry about. Let's all be happy, because guess what? Of the G7 countries, we're number 2 in terms of the GDP. Well, when you look at the other 5, not counting the U.S., which is number 1, by the way, as you know, we are tied tightly to the U.S. economy, which is roaring right now because of lower taxes and lower regulation. So he says, well, we're number 2 place in the G7, but those G7 countries are in terrible shape, the ones we're compared to. For instance, Italy, comparing us to Italy. As a matter of fact, when you look at the International Monetary Fund, and this is where they should be looking at the big comparison, it lists 193 countries, and it lists the projected growth of their economies in the year ahead. We're at about number 140 out of 193 countries in terms of our growth. That's not something that we should be sitting back and not worried about. I'm very concerned that it continues, that we don't see really serious attempts to rein in the deficit and therefore the growing debt. And as Andrew mentioned, provinces pay for this in a way, and municipalities are in their usual process of, they all come out in September saying, we're going to try and keep municipal rates to like growth rate to like maybe 9 or 10% in your taxes. Everybody goes, oh dear me. And then by November, December, it's guess what? Only a 7% increase in your municipal taxes. It's a standard procedure for them. No real control in terms of growth of spending.
I want to bring
hurting consumers.
I'd like to bring JP in here. What are you going to be watching for? I mean, there's the point that the finance ministers are getting together tonight. The discussions continue into tomorrow. What will you be looking to see?
Well, I think that Bill Morneau at some point will have to buy peace in the land by forking over some dough. I mean, I think he kind of telegraphed today by saying he's open to changing the fiscal stabilization program, that there could be changes coming to that. It's whether he goes along with what Jason Kenney wants those changes to be. He wants them to lift the cap, because there is a cap on the program. It's only $60 per resident. Alberta only tapped about $250 million last year from that program. That's a fraction, a drop in the bucket compared to the $8 billion deficit that they're running in that province right now. So, and he also, Kenny wants them also to apply retroactive payments, which I think is probably highly unlikely. He's asking for about $2.5 billion. I think Bill Morneau telegraphed today that's not going to happen by saying that they can add their voice to the conversation on what future changes there should be to this program. And future, I don't think involves giving money back to that province that they didn't have access to in the past. So that he might have to do some tinkering with that program to buy off Alberta and Saskatchewan, or at least temporarily on that front, and Newfoundland and Labrador for that matter too. They're really in a tough time with the oil price sink. They only got $8 million from that program last year. Yeah. So that's just not working. I mean, it was designed to help provinces temporarily facing budget problems, and clearly that's not what it's doing right now.
Andrew, I think you want to jump in there, and I do want to ask you the question that all Canadians want to know, that you have the answer to. What is the dinner for the federal, provincial, territorial finance ministers meeting really like? But I ask this with some serious, like, how much in the next 36 hours would we expect actually gets done at these conversations? Is this a lot of pro forma things that have been decided in advance, or could the rubber really be hitting the road?
Yeah, the rubber and the rubber chicken hit the road at about the same time at these dinners. But there is actually a lot of work that gets done. I think we underestimate just how important that fiscal federalism is, the executive federalism model that we have, the ability for the provinces and the federal government to work together. To JP's point, I think the discussion around the whole suite of issues that are impacting the amount of money that gets transferred from Ottawa to the provinces is going to be topical. Alberta would be the only province that would really benefit from a change to the Fiscal Stabilization Fund. The amount that Newfoundland or Saskatchewan would get would be pretty minimal. And so they'll be looking for other things like what can be done in the health and social transfer areas. Are there pieces around infrastructure?
It was something that
they agreed to it.
The premiers agreed to, though, right? So there is some sense that there's consensus around that as well.
Yeah, I think that's for sure. I mean, it's one of the pieces that's there. It would transfer about $4 billion to potentially $3 or $4 billion to Alberta, and a couple $100 million to Saskatchewan, maybe $1 billion to Newfoundland. So it would certainly help somewhat, but you know, the impact on the federal books would be significant, and it doesn't help provinces that are still grappling with their debt loads otherwise. So there will be, I think, a pretty fulsome conversation about what else needs to happen. We haven't really talked about the fiscal imbalance in this country since probably the days of Paul Martin, and you know, this will be an opportunity to decide whether this is one of the tools that Bill Morneau wants to pick up as a way to kind of mend the federation.